Let's move on. In my opening comments, I spent a lot of time talking about voluntary euthanasia, about dying with dignity. And as I said, Hollywood spot on 35 years ago when they made that movie and called it Whose Life Is It Anyway? And who you to tell me I can't do what I want to my body. Anyway, as I mentioned, in 2017, the Victorian Parliament passed the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill, the first state to pass such legislation. It has taken effect now. Some terminally ill people have taken that exit option. Now, to find out the latest, I'm joined by Dr. Meredith Doig and Dr. Nick Carr from Dying with Dignity Victoria. Good evening, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks for having us.
First of all, to bring me up to date, I know when the opponents of this bill were saying, well, if we bring it in, there'll be 150 people will take their lives. In the first year, have you any idea how many people actually have exercised that option?
Well, we don't know the precise numbers because the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board are keeping those numbers very closely to their chest. I think they're going to make a report in February of next year and they may reveal the numbers then. But I think, Nick, you've got a bit of a sense of how many might have at least applied.
So the legislation's only been running for just over 5 months, and in that first month, at least 120 people have applied and been accepted as possibly going to use the Act, but the number of people who've actually taken the medication is far smaller than that. It's only a handful at this stage. Yeah,
well, we had the early case, a very respectful case earlier this year, which has got a lot of publicity.
Kerry Robertson.
The Robertson case, yes. I thought it was, we enjoyed Dying with Dignity. She and her family showed so much dignity through the whole thing. The daughters did as well.
In a very compassionate way that she experienced the end of her life, being racked, as you said before, with so much pain, but she was able to choose a way to end that pain with her family around her. It was a beautiful way to go.
Darren, you talked about your mum's experience. I haven't been there yet when someone's taken the medication, but I was talking with a doctor who has, and this is a doctor who's seen a lot of deaths in hospital, and he said this Dying with Dignity death through the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act was the most beautiful death he had ever seen. It was tear-inducing because he said it was just so beautiful compared to most of his deaths.
Well, I've talked before about a case where two daughters came from South Australia to their mother here in Melbourne, and she had broken the law and smuggled Nembutal in from Mexico. And the awful thing about it was that about an hour before she took the Nembutal, she insisted that her daughters leave the motel room, and so this mother died alone in a motel room when she should have had her two daughters there, like this earlier case, holding her hand.
And she was being careful for her daughter's well-being because at the time they may have been charged with being accessories.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Now,
very sad.
There is a review coming up on it. What do you think? From what you know, you've been studying a lot, and I know a couple of my state politicians, Stuart Grimley and Tanya Maxwell, they are pushing for more information about it. What are you looking for? I mean, there is a review. What do you think the faults are still that are coming out?
Yeah.
So there are several areas where we feel that it's incredibly tight legislation, and we know that. But in some ways, the tightness of that legislation has led to difficulties that we weren't expecting. One of them is that doctors are forbidden to bring up the topic of voluntary assisted dying with a patient. The patient actually has to use those words.
To be get the exact words again, as to say?
So the patient has to go to a doctor and say, "Doctor, I am interested in accessing the voluntary assisted dying legislation," or words almost to that effect. Okay. We are not allowed to tell them that it's one of their options. So if a patient comes to me and says, "I've got cancer, I'm dying, what are my options, doc?" I'm not allowed to mention voluntary assisted dying. And we see this...
Is that in the legislation?
That is currently in the legislation. And this is a restriction which we feel is far too severe because there will be people out there who don't know it's an option. There may be people from non-English speaking backgrounds or people from less educated backgrounds or all sorts of parts of the society where they don't know that they could choose this. And we're not allowed to tell them.
Yeah, well, and also they have to. There are restrictions too on the qualifications of the doctors that they can rely on.
So this is another area that we have concerns about. Currently, both doctors have to be trained, which is fine, but one of them has to be a specialist, and it's actually very hard at the moment. There are so few people who've done the training. I've had 2 of my patients die before they could get access to the medication because of the delays getting specialists to give them the opinion.
Which seems to be just cruel at the end of somebody's life when they're really wanting to have a calm and a peaceful exit. And the legislation, inadvertently, is actually giving more anxiety and more stress to these people at the end of their lives because of the hurdles that they have to go over.
Well, the quote specialist, what must they be a specialist in?
Well, that's one of the difficult areas. They're supposed to have a minimum of 5 years' experience in the disease that the person is suffering from. Take someone with a blood cancer at the moment. We currently have no haematologists in Victoria who are trained in voluntary assisted dying care. So it is very hard. And our view is that we need a specialist to say what's going on, but we should be able to have any specialist, not necessarily someone who's VAD trained, because we just need a specialist to say what someone's prognosis is. The doctors who are trained in providing voluntary assisted dying care can take care of the rest.
But you might, I mean, you could start to go through the system, discuss it with your family, and then say, yes, I think this is an option I want to explore, but it may take 7 months for a specialist to see you.
7 months would be a terrifyingly long time. We actually have some dedicated specialists here in Victoria who've been travelling around the state providing this because there's so few people doing it. This problem will get better as people get trained. So it's a short-term problem, but at the moment it is a problem.
But therein lies, I think, a lesson for other states that are going through the process of inquiring into possible legislation in Western Australia.
SA, South Australia, WA, both
also Queensland. Also Queensland is looking at it. So at Dying with Dignity Victoria, we are writing to those states and to our sister organisations in the other states saying, look, this is our experience. Try to make sure that when your legislation comes in, that you avoid these problems. So at the moment, the Victorian legislation is incredibly risk-averse, and we understand why that's the case.
Well, because the climate at the time, they went along that line to try and get the votes. Because people were scared, and some people were wavering, thought, well, if you make it as tight as you can. I mean, I was disappointed how tight it really was in the end. You know.
But we got the legislation.
Yeah, that's true.
And to give you an example of where that tightness has caused trouble, you have to be an Australian citizen. A patient of mine who'd been living in this country since 1961 but never took out citizenship was deemed ineligible, even though he'd been in this country since 1961.
Why would you have to be an Australian citizen? I mean, you have to, the other protections there, because the other restrictions there, you have to be a Victorian resident for 12 months, isn't it?
That's right.
But you also have to be an Australian citizen. And this is the detail of the interpretation. So in this particular person, he was dying of pancreatic cancer. He had no one around him. And when I told him that he wasn't eligible, he committed suicide on his own. Exactly what we are trying to stop. So there are problems with all these safeguards. But the good bit, because I don't want to bag this legislation because it was made deliberately tight, as you know, because it wouldn't have gone through otherwise. But we at least have the legislation. And when we talk to people about this, I see the relief that goes through people's systems, knowing that this is an option. It changes.
And the other thing that I know that Nitschke and I have discussed in the past, I know of people who illegally got an Embutal into Australia and hid it in their house and didn't use it because they had to safeguard the insurance policy saying, if I need it, it is there.
And that's what we found even with the implementation of this legislation. As Nick said, there's over 100 people who've applied, but a much smaller number of people who've actually taken the medication. Just having that option there gives them a sense of relief, a sense of control, that they're not subject to the whims of the medical system. They have some dignity towards the end of their lives.
Actually, Meredith, the line you used is the one. They have a sense of control.
Yes.
To me, that's the most important thing, that I have some control over my life in my twilight.
Rather than just being a subject that other people do things to.
It's actually a very important point, because people sometimes say, well, all we need is better palliative care. If we can manage pain and nausea, why do we need voluntary assisted dying? But the main reason people want voluntary assisted dying is not uncontrolled pain or nausea. It's loss of autonomy, loss of dignity, loss of control.
I shouldn't go into this, but I did attend some of the hearings at Victorian Parliament where they had the hearings into it. And as I walked in, there was a There was a priest there from Central Casting with the white hair and the white beard. And as I walked out, I hear him saying, we could all die a holy and happy death, pushing palliative care. And I thought, OK, I've used sunshine, but some people don't and can't and don't want to.
This is the problem with some of the religious leaders, that they see that their doctrine should prevail over everybody else. We're not asking them to take advantage of this legislation, but they don't have the right, surely, to tell us what options we should have.
There's the word voluntary's in there.
It's not only voluntary, but it's also dying. Don't forget, these people are dying anyway. It's not a choice between life and death. It's a choice between two types of dying. One which is in incredible suffering, not only potentially painful suffering, but existential suffering, and the other with a sense of having control with the people that you love around you in the most beautiful, well, in whatever sort of situation you care to design, and have that sense of peace at the end of your life.
I agree 100%. I know we'll talk again. Thanks for that.
My pleasure.